We're going to continue with our learning on shofarot. If you remember, the Torah verses in shofarot, a rare word in the Torah, are all related to God's revelation on Sinai. So we're going to get the second of the verses in which God reveals God's self on Sinai using the shofar, and we're going to see that it's sort of a strange pasuk that the Midrashim are going to make a lot of hay about, because it's not exactly clear how the interaction between God's voice and Moshe's voice is playing out. So that's the interpretive question on the table, and also sort of allows us to ask the question: in what way are we following God's lead as the lawgiver, and in what way is God responding to our voice as people in relationship with God? Vayihi kol hashofar holech v'chazek me'od, Moshe yidaber v'ha'elohim ya'anenu v'kol. So again, this is just a few verses later from what we saw yesterday, where the kolot and brakim and the kol shofar, the thunder and the lightning and the sound of the shofar, were introducing the revelation. And now we get this verse that says, the blare of the horn, the shofar, grew louder and louder. Moshe yidaber, translated here at JPS, as Moses spoke, Ve'Elohim, and God answered him through kol. JPS translating that as thunder, which makes sense in the context of the other use of the word kol in this chapter. But also kol is a sound or a voice, and that's part of the interpretive opportunity we have here with this. Moshe yidaber, Moshe speaks, and God answers. Okay, so let's see how the Midrash understands this. Basing itself on a verse from Psalms, which ends Ve'anvatcha tarbeni, which is, translated in JPS as "your care has made me great," but anava doesn't really mean care so much as humility. Moshe was the most anav of any person ever, but here it's addressing God. God's humility made me great. Your humility made me great. What could that mean? In what way did God's humility make me great? So this is what the Midrash is going to pick up on using our verse. Your humility has made me great. Amar Rabbi Luliani bar Tavrini, a rabbi I have not encountered before. Actually, Luliani is one of those names that apparently, because we didn't change our name to Lulianis, then we were redeemed from Egypt. But here we have a rabbi named Luliani. He said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, Re'ei anavto shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, see the humility of the Holy Blessed One. Rei maktiv, look at what's written. Moshe would speak, Moshe yidaber ve'Elohim ya'anenu b'kol, and God would answer him in sound or with voice. Lo haya tzarich lomar ela ha'Elohim yidaber u'Moshe ya'anenu b'kol. It got it backwards. It should have said that God would speak and Moshe would respond with voice, like Moshe would repeat maybe what God had said. So if you look at kol here not as thunder but as voice or sound, it doesn't make any sense for Moshe to speak and God to react. Rather, God should speak and Moshe should react. But that's not what happened. Lo asakein. That's not the way it went down. Ella Moshe yidaber v'Elohim ya'anenu b'kol. That is the example of your humility has made me great. Okay, so this is we saw this in Malchiot, if you remember way back, where the way in which God becomes king and acts as king is the opposite of a human king. A human king, grabs all the power for himself, but God, transfers power without any fear of ultimate authority being wrested from God. And here too, Moshe is the one who is leading this dialogue, as it were, and God is responding, and that's God's humility that makes me, the human in this interaction, great. So our verse is sort of highlighting the possibility that in the interaction between God and humans, it's not a one-way street. In fact, Moshe, the human, not just any human, but still a human, can lead the the dialogue and God responding. And let's see how this develops a little bit further, because in another midrash, it takes this image and pushes it a little bit. So we have another report or alternative tradition from Rabbi Luliani, this time in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. It's the way of the world, b'nohag shebaolam, harav omer v'talmid oneh. The teacher speaks and the students respond. V'kadosh baruch hu eino kein, but God isn't like that. Ela Moshe yidaber v'Elohim yanen. No one's disputing that Moshe is the student and God's the teacher, but it's the reverse. The student speaks first. The student is the one who's driving the dialogue. Moshe yidaber, and only then God responds. V'Elohim yanen b'kol. And now this takes it to the next level. Ma b'kol. What does it mean? God answered with kol, with voice. What's the voice that God used? B'kolo shel Moshe. Not only did God respond to Moshe's lead, but God actually responded in the register, in the sound of Moshe's own voice. That is to say, and we'll see this, Midrash develops this as well, it's not just that the student leads the dialogue, but also the teacher speaks in a voice in which the student can understand. It's the voice of the student that the teacher echoes, as opposed to everybody holding on to their own vocal register. So this just pushes this idea further, not just that Moshe is leading the dialogue, the student was leading the dialogue, but that the teacher speaks in the voice of the student. Moshe daber v'Elohim yanenu b'kol b'kolo shel Moshe, in the voice of Moshe himself. Okay, so this is a sort of a larger theme when we think about Revelation, which is the voice that God speaks is not wholly separate and different from the voices that we speak or the voices that we can understand. I'll bring you one version of that idea that also uses our verse here. Bo re'eh, come and see how the voice went out to Israel. How did the voice at the moment of Sinai go out into the people? And we saw yesterday that there was a silence. God is in the silence that follows the blast of the shofar. Everybody was silent to hear God's voice. Now we're going to hear a different take on what it means for people to absorb God's voice. Everybody heard according to their ability, according to their potential. And then they start listing examples. Azikenim, elders according to their ability, Bachurim, Na'arim, Ketanim, Yonkin, and Olalim, all different levels of going down the age ladder, all the way down to infants. Everybody heard God's voice according to their ability. Baf Moshe lefikocho, and even Moshe heard God according to Moshe's own ability. Shne'emar, here's our verse, as it says, Moshe yidaber v'Elohim yanenu b'kol. Ma'u b'kol, what's the voice that God uses to respond to Moshe? Ela b'kol shaya yachol Moshe lisbol. It was the voice that Moshe was able to handle, to suffer. It was like sort of the maximum that Moshe could take, but nevertheless, lefi kocho, according to what he was able to handle. And then calling off another verse that we know from Kabbalat Shabbat and other places in Psalm 29, B'cheinu Omer, so it says also, Kol Adonai B'koach, the voice of God is in koach, but here not koach doesn't mean power or strength, but in potential or ability. The ability of every single person, that's where God's kol is found. Not that there's a objective level of kol, of voice, and everybody has to attune to it, but rather God speaks in the way that everybody, including infants, all the way up to the elderly, can hear on their own. And even pregnant people, presumably the inside the womb is also hearing what God is saying according to their ability. Hakol lefi kochan. Everybody is hearing God according to their ability. So what we have here is an opportunity to think about on Rosh Hashanah in one of these verses on shofarot, not just the sound of the shofar, but what the shofar precedes. It precedes a dialogue in which Moshe is taking the lead and not God. And the response that comes from God is in the voice register of the person who is engaging in that dialogue. In this case, it's Moshe, but in our case, it could be us. And how might we hear God's voice or God's commands or God's reaching out to us in a voice that we can all understand.